cameras were already rolling. The studio lights burned above the stage, bright enough to erase every shadow except the ones people carried inside themselves. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk, smiling with the effortless confidence of a man who had spent years controlling live television. The audience was laughing, applauding, whispering to one another. But then the camera slowly moved toward the two women seated across from him, and the laughter changed, because sitting there were two of the most recognizable women in Hollywood: Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Marilyn sat beneath the studio lights in a glamorous dress, her famous blonde hair perfectly arranged. She smiled toward the audience, but there was something different behind that smile tonight. Something tired, something guarded. Beside her, Elizabeth Taylor looked calm and composed. Her posture was confident. Her eyes were sharp. She had the kind of presence that didn't require an introduction. The audience knew exactly what they were looking at. Two legends, two icons, two women. Hollywood had spent years placing inside the same invisible ring. And that was the problem, because long before they had ever sat beside each other, Hollywood had already decided they were supposed to be enemies. One was the blonde bombshell. The other was the beautiful actress. One was the fantasy. The other was the serious star. One had become the face of desire. The other had become the face of dramatic glamour. Magazine covers compared them. Fans argued about them. Hollywood insiders whispered about them. And every time one woman achieved something, someone found a way to ask why the other hadn't done it first. Who was more beautiful? Who was more talented? Who had greater star power? Who could command a room? Who could make an audience fall silent? The questions never ended, and now somehow all of that history had been brought into one television studio. Carson smiled at the audience. "Well," he said, "I have to admit, this may be the most dangerous couch I've ever had on this show." The audience exploded with laughter. Marilyn laughed too. Elizabeth smiled. For a moment, everything was harmless. Normal. Television. Then Carson looked at Marilyn, then at Elizabeth. And his expression changed just slightly. He knew what the audience wanted. Everyone did. Carson leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, "Hollywood has spent a great deal of time comparing the two of you." The audience laughed again. Marilyn lowered her eyes. Elizabeth crossed her legs. Carson continued. "They've compared your looks, your careers, your popularity." He paused. "And practically everything else." Marilyn smiled politely. Elizabeth nodded. Carson looked between them. "So I thought I'd ask the question everyone else is too afraid to ask." The audience immediately became louder. Marilyn's smile froze for half a second. Elizabeth looked directly at Carson. Carson leaned toward the microphone. "If Hollywood forced you to choose..." He paused. The audience leaned forward. "Which one of you is the bigger star?" Silence. Not the comfortable silence of a television pause. A different kind. A silence that arrives when everyone suddenly realizes a joke might have gone too far. Marilyn looked at Carson. Then she slowly turned toward Elizabeth. Elizabeth was already looking at her. Their eyes met. Neither woman smiled. Then Elizabeth gave a quiet laugh. "I don't think that's a very fair question." The audience laughed nervously. Carson grinned. "That's precisely why it's a good television question." More laughter. But Marilyn didn't laugh this time. She looked down at her hands. The studio lights reflected against the rings on her fingers. For several seconds, she remained completely still, because the question wasn't new. She had heard versions of it for years. Who are you competing with? Who is prettier? Who is more desirable? Who is more successful? Who deserves the spotlight? But beneath all those questions was something much more painful, a question nobody ever seemed interested in asking. Who are you when the cameras are gone? Marilyn slowly raised her eyes. Carson was still smiling. Elizabeth wasn't. She had noticed the change in Marilyn's expression. Carson continued. I mean, surely you must have an opinion. Marilyn looked at him. About what? About who is the real star. Marilyn's lips curved into the faintest smile. The real star? Yes. She glanced toward Elizabeth, then back at Carson. What makes someone real? The audience went quiet. Carson blinked. He hadn't expected that answer. Elizabeth leaned slightly forward. Marilyn continued. Is it how many people know your name? Carson listened. Is it how many photographs they take of you? She paused. Or how many people think they know you? Nobody laughed. The atmosphere had changed. Carson slowly lowered his cue cards. Elizabeth watched Marilyn carefully. Marilyn looked toward the audience. Because sometimes, her voice became softer. The person everyone thinks they know isn't the person standing in front of them. The audience remained silent. For the first time that evening, the glamorous image had cracked. Not completely. Just enough for something human to appear underneath. Elizabeth finally spoke. I understand that. Marilyn turned toward her. Elizabeth continued. People think they know you because they've seen your photographs. Marilyn nodded. They think they know your life because they've read about it. Elizabeth smiled sadly. And sometimes they know more about the headlines than they know about you. Marilyn looked at her. Something changed between them. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. It wasn't agreement. It was recognition. Because Elizabeth knew what it meant to be watched. She knew what it meant to have strangers decide who you were. She knew what it meant to walk into a room and feel 1,000 invisible judgments arriving before you did. Marilyn knew that feeling too, maybe better than anyone. Carson, sensing the heaviness, tried to bring the laughter back. Well, I suppose that's the price of being famous. Marilyn looked at him. Is it? The audience became silent again. Carson smiled uncertainly. Marilyn didn't. Is being famous supposed to mean people own your story? The question landed like a stone. Carson leaned back. Elizabeth looked down for a moment. Marilyn continued. They decide what you are. She touched her hair. They decide what you look like. She looked toward the audience. They decide what you should say. Then she pointed gently toward the cameras. And then they decide what you meant. Nobody moved. Marilyn's voice remained calm, but there was pain beneath every word. And when you disagree, she paused. They say you're difficult. Elizabeth slowly nodded. Carson looked between them. The audience was no longer watching a celebrity interview. They were watching something much more personal. Carson asked quietly, Do you think Hollywood has treated you unfairly? Marilyn smiled. That depends on which version of Hollywood you're talking about. A few people laughed. Even Elizabeth smiled. But Marilyn's expression remained serious. The Hollywood that photographs you? She paused. The Hollywood that sells you? Another pause. Or the Hollywood that forgets you're human? The room went completely still. Elizabeth looked at Marilyn with something close to admiration. Carson had nowhere to hide behind a joke now. He placed his cards on the desk. You feel people have misunderstood you? Marilyn stared at him. I think people prefer misunderstanding. Carson frowned. Why? Because understanding takes time. She looked toward Elizabeth. And people don't have time for complicated women. Elizabeth gave a small smile. That may be the truest thing you've said tonight. The audience laughed softly. Marilyn smiled. For a moment, the tension disappeared. But then Carson asked the question that brought it all back. So, he looked between them. If Hollywood created this rivalry, he paused. Do you think there is any truth to it? Elizabeth answered first. No. Marilyn looked at her. Elizabeth continued. I think people wanted there to be. Carson raised an eyebrow. Why? Elizabeth shrugged. Because competition sells. Marilyn nodded slowly. Especially between women. The audience reacted. Marilyn continued. They don't want two women sitting beside each other. She looked toward Elizabeth. They want one woman standing. She turned toward the audience. And the other one falling. A wave of silence passed through the studio. Elizabeth's eyes softened. Marilyn looked at her. For several seconds, they simply stared at one another. Then Elizabeth said quietly, Maybe that's why they keep asking which one of us is better. Marilyn smiled faintly. Maybe. Elizabeth leaned toward her microphone. And maybe we've been answering the wrong question. Carson looked confused. What question should you be answering? Marilyn slowly pulled her microphone closer. The audience waited. Elizabeth waited. Carson waited. Marilyn's eyes were fixed on Elizabeth now. Her voice was quiet. But every person in the studio heard it. Then let's answer it, Carson asked. Answer what? Marilyn didn't look at him. She looked directly at Elizabeth, and then she said, Who is real? The audience stopped breathing. Elizabeth's expression changed. Carson's smile vanished. Marilyn leaned forward. Because if everyone keeps telling us we're supposed to be enemies, she paused. Maybe tonight we should find out why. Elizabeth stared at her. For one long moment, nothing happened. Then Elizabeth slowly reached for her microphone. Her voice was calm. All right. The audience waited. Elizabeth looked directly at Marilyn. Let's find out. The studio erupted in nervous applause, but neither woman smiled, because everyone suddenly understood that this was no longer a playful television segment. Something deeper had been opened. Something neither Carson nor the audience could easily close. The cameras kept rolling. The lights burned brighter. And behind those perfect Hollywood faces were two women who had spent years being told what they were supposed to be. But tonight, for the first time, they were about to ask the question Hollywood had never wanted them to ask. Not who was prettier. Not who was more famous. Not who was the bigger star. But something far more dangerous. Who had written the story that made them enemies in the first place? And before the night was over, someone was going to have. The studio had changed. Just minutes earlier, the audience had been laughing. Now nobody seemed to know whether they were supposed to breathe. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk, with his cards resting untouched in front of him. Across from him, Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor were no longer smiling for the cameras. They were looking at each other. And somewhere between the lights, the cameras, and the silence, the conversation had stopped being television. It had become personal. Carson slowly leaned forward. All right, he said carefully. Let's talk about it. Marilyn didn't move. Elizabeth nodded. Carson looked at them. For years, people have assumed that the two of you were competing. Marilyn smiled faintly. They still do, Carson asked. And you don't think that's true? Elizabeth answered immediately. No. Marilyn looked at her. Elizabeth continued. I think people wanted it to be true. The audience murmured. Carson raised an eyebrow. Why? Elizabeth took a breath. Because it's easier to sell two women as rivals than it is to explain two complicated women. Marilyn smiled. That sounds about right. Carson glanced at Marilyn. You agree? She nodded. Completely. Then Marilyn looked toward the audience. They've been doing it for years, Carson asked. Doing what? Comparing. She paused. Everything. Her fingers slowly tightened around the microphone. Looks, Careers, clothes, men, movies, money, popularity. She looked toward Elizabeth. Even the way we smile. Elizabeth laughed quietly. That one is true. The audience laughed with her. For a second, the tension softened. But Marilyn wasn't finished. They don't just compare us. Her expression became serious again. They decide what the comparison means. Carson looked at her. How? Marilyn leaned closer. If Elizabeth gets a great role, they say she's proving she's a serious actress. Elizabeth nodded. If I get a glamorous role, Marilyn continued, they say she's proving she's beautiful. Elizabeth smiled. And if Marilyn becomes more famous, Marilyn finished the thought. They say she's proving beauty is enough. Silence. Elizabeth looked at Marilyn. Exactly. Marilyn turned toward her. And if I want to be taken seriously, she paused. They say I'm trying too hard. Elizabeth's expression tightened. Marilyn continued. If I speak confidently, I'm difficult. If I defend myself, I'm emotional. If I stay quiet, I'm stupid. If I smile, I'm pretending. She stared at the audience. And if I cry, her voice softened. I'm weak. No one laughed. The studio felt smaller now. Carson looked down. He had spent his career turning uncomfortable moments into jokes. But there was no joke that could fit here. Elizabeth slowly spoke. They did that to me too. Marilyn turned. Elizabeth looked at her. Not in exactly the same way, but in a different way. She paused. They decided I was lucky. Marilyn listened. Lucky because I was beautiful. Elizabeth's eyes became distant. Lucky because I was famous. Lucky because I had opportunities. Lucky because people wanted to look at me. She smiled sadly. But nobody asks what happens after the cameras stop. Marilyn nodded. Elizabeth continued. People think beauty protects you. Marilyn whispered. It doesn't. Elizabeth looked at her. No. The audience sat completely still. Carson finally asked, What does it feel like? Elizabeth looked toward him. What? To have millions of people watching you? Elizabeth thought for a moment. Sometimes. She paused. It feels like being loved by people who don't know you. Marilyn looked down. That sentence hit her harder than Carson expected. Elizabeth continued. And sometimes, that can be lonelier than being ignored. Marilyn slowly raised her eyes. I know. Those two words were barely audible, but they carried years inside them. Carson looked between them. Do you think that's what people don't understand about fame? Marilyn answered. They think fame means you're never alone. She shook her head. Sometimes fame is the reason you're alone. The audience remained silent. Marilyn's voice became more emotional. People see the crowds. They see the cameras. They see the flowers. They see the photographs. But they don't see the room after everyone leaves. She swallowed. They don't hear the silence. Elizabeth watched her carefully. Then she reached across and touched Marilyn's hand. The audience reacted with a soft gasp. Marilyn looked down at their hands. Elizabeth didn't move hers. You don't have to explain it, she whispered. Marilyn looked at her. Maybe I do. Elizabeth shook her head. No. A pause. Maybe for once, you don't. Marilyn's eyes became wet. Carson sat silently. The audience was no longer waiting for a fight. They were witnessing something completely different. Two women realizing that the stories written about them had hidden the truth from everyone. Carson finally asked, Then why do you think people are so determined to compare you? Marilyn looked toward Elizabeth. Elizabeth answered, Because they need a winner. Marilyn nodded. And a loser. Elizabeth continued, They need someone to be better. Marilyn added, and someone to be less. Carson looked at them. So who is better? Marilyn smiled. That's the question, isn't it? Elizabeth laughed. It's also the wrong question. Carson leaned back. Then what's the right one? Marilyn looked directly into the camera. Why do they need us to be enemies? Silence. The question seemed to echo through the studio. Carson didn't answer. Elizabeth didn't either. Because there was an uncomfortable truth hidden inside it. Hollywood had always loved stories, and rivalry was one of the easiest stories to sell. Two beautiful women, two different personalities, two careers, one crown. It was simple. It was dramatic. It was profitable. But real life was never that simple. Marilyn looked at Elizabeth. Do you remember the first time you realized people were comparing us? Elizabeth smiled. Yes. When? Elizabeth thought. A long time ago. What did you think? Elizabeth laughed. I thought it was ridiculous. Marilyn smiled. So did I. Carson interrupted. But you must have felt something. Elizabeth looked at him. What? Jealousy. The audience reacted. Elizabeth's face became serious. Marilyn looked at her. For several seconds, Elizabeth said nothing. Then she answered, I've felt jealousy. Marilyn raised her eyebrows. Elizabeth continued, I've felt insecurity. She looked toward Marilyn. I've felt anger. Then she looked at Carson. But none of those things made Marilyn my enemy. Marilyn's expression softened. Elizabeth continued, sometimes you can admire someone and still feel insecure around them. Marilyn nodded. That's true. You can look at someone else's success and wonder why you're struggling. Marilyn nodded again. That doesn't make you hate them. Elizabeth smiled. It makes you human. Marilyn looked toward the audience. And Hollywood doesn't like human. Carson asked, what is Hollywood like? Marilyn smiled. Characters. The audience laughed softly. But characters don't get tired. She continued, characters don't get hurt. Characters don't get scared. Characters don't wake up at 3 in the morning wondering whether they're enough. Elizabeth looked at her. And characters don't grow old. The room went silent. That sentence struck differently. Marilyn looked at Elizabeth. Neither woman needed to explain what she meant. Hollywood could turn a woman into an image. But images were expected to remain perfect forever. People wanted the photograph, not the person. The fantasy, not the fear. The smile, not the tears. Carson slowly asked, do you think people would treat you differently if they knew the real you? Marilyn thought about it. I don't know. Why? Because sometimes. She looked toward Elizabeth. I don't think they want to know the real me. Elizabeth interrupted softly. I think some people do. Marilyn looked at her. Elizabeth smiled. I do. For the first time that night, Marilyn laughed. Not the famous Marilyn laugh. Not the laugh audiences expected. A real laugh. Small, warm, uncontrolled. The audience laughed with her. Carson smiled. Now that's the first honest laugh I've heard all night. Marilyn shook her head. Johnny. Yes? You've been trying very hard to make us fight. The audience exploded with laughter. Carson raised both hands. I've been trying to make good television. Elizabeth laughed. And what's better television than a fight? Carson thought about it. Apparently, he looked at both women. This. The audience applauded, but then Marilyn's smile faded. She looked toward Carson. There's something I want to say. Carson nodded. Go ahead. Marilyn took a deep breath. When people look at me, she paused. They see Marilyn Monroe. She looked toward Elizabeth. When people look at Elizabeth, she smiled faintly. They see Elizabeth Taylor. Then she looked directly at the camera. But sometimes I wonder." She stopped. The room waited. "Do they see the women underneath those names?" Nobody spoke. Marilyn continued. "Because if they did," she looked at Elizabeth, "they might realize we have more in common than they think." Elizabeth nodded. "We do." Marilyn smiled. "You've been judged for being beautiful." Elizabeth nodded. "So have you. You've been judged for who you loved. So have you. You've been judged for every decision you've made." Elizabeth looked toward her. "So have you." Marilyn's voice became almost a whisper. "And you've been told what kind of woman you're supposed to be." Elizabeth answered, "Every day." The audience sat frozen. Then Elizabeth slowly stood. Marilyn looked at her. Elizabeth extended her hand. Marilyn stared at it. For a second, it seemed as though she didn't know what to do. Then she stood too. She took Elizabeth's hand. The audience erupted into applause. Carson stood behind his desk. The two women remained there, holding hands beneath the studio lights. Not as rivals, not as competitors, not as Hollywood's two opposing symbols, but simply as two women who had finally understood what everyone else had missed. The rivalry had never been between them. It had been between the versions of them the world had created. And yet there was still one question hanging in the air. Carson looked at them. "If you aren't rivals," he paused, "then what are you?" Marilyn looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at Marilyn. Neither answered immediately. Then Marilyn slowly returned to her chair. She pulled the microphone closer. Her eyes moved toward the camera, and her voice became calm, certain, almost fearless. "We're survivors." Elizabeth sat beside her. She nodded. "Yes." The audience erupted again. But Marilyn wasn't finished. She looked straight into the camera. "And maybe," she paused, "that's the one thing they never wanted us to realize." Carson asked, "What?" Marilyn looked toward Elizabeth, then back at the audience. "That we were never fighting each other. A beat. They were fighting to decide who we were." The applause exploded, and for a moment, Carson could only watch, because the interview had become something nobody had planned, something nobody could control. But Marilyn still had one final truth buried inside her, a truth about the woman behind the famous smile. And if she said it aloud, there would be no way to return to the comfortable Hollywood fantasy. The cameras kept rolling. The audience waited. Elizabeth squeezed Marilyn's hand, and Marilyn slowly leaned toward the microphone, because the most painful part of her story was still waiting. The studio was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes before a joke. Not the kind of silence that television producers fear. This was different. It was the silence that comes when everyone in the room realizes they are witnessing something they were never supposed to see. Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor were sitting beside each other. Their hands were still connected. Johnny Carson stood behind his desk, watching them with an expression that had almost completely lost its usual television confidence. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't whispering. They weren't waiting for another celebrity joke. They were waiting for Marilyn to speak, because moments earlier she had said something that had changed the entire conversation. They were never fighting each other. They had been fighting to decide who they were. Marilyn slowly released Elizabeth's hand. She looked down for a moment. Then she raised her eyes toward Carson. "You asked me who the real star is." Carson nodded. Marilyn smiled faintly. "I think I finally understood why I hate that question." "Why?" "Because it assumes there can only be one." Elizabeth looked toward her. Marilyn continued. "Only one beautiful woman. Only one successful woman. Only one woman worth remembering." She paused. "And if another woman appears," her voice became quieter, "she has to become the competition." The audience listened. Marilyn turned toward Elizabeth. But what if she isn't? Elizabeth smiled. What if she's just another woman trying to survive the same world? Marilyn nodded. Exactly. Carson slowly sat down. For once, he wasn't trying to guide the conversation. He was allowing it to happen. Marilyn looked toward the audience. You know what people don't understand? No one answered. They think being admired means being understood. She shook her head. It doesn't. They can adore your face. She touched her cheek, and still never ask how you feel. She looked toward Elizabeth. They can call you beautiful. Elizabeth nodded, and still make you feel like you're only valuable when you're beautiful. The room became painfully quiet. Marilyn continued. They can put your name on the front page. She paused. And still make you feel invisible. Elizabeth's expression softened. She reached toward Marilyn again. This time, Marilyn took her hand immediately. Carson watched. The cameras remained fixed on them. Marilyn whispered, "That's what fame can do." Elizabeth squeezed her hand. "It can make the whole world look at you." She finished the sentence. "While nobody actually sees you." Marilyn looked at her. For a moment, there were no cameras, no audience, no Carson. Just two women who understood something about each other that millions of people never had. Then Carson asked quietly, "Do you think you would have been friends if Hollywood hadn't spent so much time comparing you?" Marilyn smiled. "Maybe." Elizabeth laughed softly. "Probably." Carson smiled. "Then why didn't you become friends?" Elizabeth looked toward Marilyn. "Maybe because everyone kept telling us we were supposed to be something else." Marilyn nodded. "That happens." "What?" "When enough people tell you a story." She paused. "Sometimes you start believing it yourself." That sentence landed harder than anything else, because it wasn't only about Hollywood. It was about identity, about labels, about the invisible cages people build around famous faces. Marilyn looked toward the camera. "They told me who I was." She paused. For so long, her voice trembled. "I almost forgot I was allowed to decide." Elizabeth looked at her. "You are." Marilyn turned. Elizabeth repeated, "You are allowed to decide who you are." Marilyn's eyes filled with tears. For a moment, she tried to hide them. But then she stopped. She let them fall. The audience became completely still. The woman who had been photographed thousands of times was suddenly doing something cameras rarely captured. She wasn't performing. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't pretending everything was perfect. She was simply crying. And somehow, that was more powerful than any glamorous photograph. Carson looked down. Even he seemed uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment. Marilyn wiped her cheek. "I'm sorry." Elizabeth immediately shook her head. "Don't apologize." Marilyn smiled through her tears. "I'm supposed to be the funny one tonight." The audience laughed softly. Carson smiled. "You're doing fine." Marilyn looked at him. "You know, Johnny." "Yes?" "Maybe people don't always need us to make them laugh." Carson nodded. "Sometimes." She looked toward the audience. "Maybe they need us to tell them the truth." The applause began slowly. One person, then another, then dozens, then the entire studio. Marilyn looked overwhelmed. Elizabeth stood beside her. The applause grew louder. But then Carson raised his hand. The room slowly quieted. He looked at both women. "I think I owe you a different question." Marilyn smiled. "All right." Carson looked at her. "If you could change one thing about the way people see you." He paused. "What would it be?" Marilyn didn't answer immediately. She stared into the distance. Then she said, "I would want them to understand that I'm more than the woman they see." Carson nodded. And you, Elizabeth? Elizabeth thought for a moment. I would want them to understand that being strong doesn't mean you don't hurt. Marilyn looked at her. Elizabeth continued. And being beautiful doesn't mean you're fearless. Marilyn smiled. And being famous doesn't mean you're happy. Elizabeth nodded. The three of them sat quietly. Then Carson looked at Marilyn. One last question. Marilyn raised an eyebrow. You've said that before. The audience laughed. Carson smiled. This one really is the last. All right. Carson looked between them. If you had the chance to say one thing to everyone who spent years comparing you, he paused. What would you say? Marilyn looked toward Elizabeth. Elizabeth nodded. Marilyn turned toward the camera. Her expression became completely serious. I would say, she paused. Stop. The audience became silent. Stop asking which woman is better, she continued. Stop asking which woman is more beautiful. Another pause. Stop asking which woman deserves the spotlight. Her voice grew stronger. Because there is enough light. Elizabeth smiled. Marilyn continued. There is enough room for both of us. The audience erupted. Elizabeth stood. She turned toward Marilyn. There is enough room for all of us. Marilyn smiled. The applause became deafening. Carson stood beside them. The cameras moved closer. The two women looked at each other. And for one brief moment, the entire mythology surrounding them seemed to disappear. There was no blonde bombshell, no Hollywood beauty, no rival, no competition. Just Marilyn. Just Elizabeth. And two women who had spent years being watched by the world, finally looking at each other without the world standing between them. Carson smiled. Well, he looked toward the audience. I suppose we didn't get the fight everyone expected. The audience laughed. Marilyn looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth laughed. Carson continued. But I think we got something better. Marilyn nodded. Yes. What? Marilyn looked toward the camera. The truth. The studio erupted again. And then something unexpected happened. Elizabeth leaned toward Marilyn and whispered something into her ear. Marilyn immediately laughed. A genuine laugh. The audience laughed too. Carson tried to hear what Elizabeth had said. What did she tell you? Marilyn shook her head. I'm not telling. Carson protested. This is my show. Elizabeth laughed. Exactly. The audience exploded. For the first time that night, the tension was completely gone. The light seemed warmer. The atmosphere felt lighter. And yet, beneath all the laughter, something important had happened. The audience had arrived expecting a spectacle. They expected jealousy. They expected competition. They expected one woman to attack the other. Instead, they had watched two women tear apart the very idea that they had to compete. And perhaps that was the most powerful ending possible, because the world had spent years asking which one was better. But the women themselves had finally answered. Neither. Both. And neither answer was a defeat. It was freedom. The cameras slowly began to pull back. Carson returned to his desk. Marilyn and Elizabeth remained seated together. The audience continued applauding. Marilyn looked toward Elizabeth one final time. You know. Elizabeth turned. What? I think they expected us to hate each other. Elizabeth smiled. They did. Marilyn shook her head. That's sad. Why? Because they missed the obvious. Elizabeth waited. Marilyn smiled. We were never the story. Elizabeth looked at her. What was? Marilyn turned toward the camera. The story they created about us. The camera slowly moved closer. Her face filled the screen. And for a moment, the famous Marilyn Monroe image disappeared. There was only a woman looking directly at millions of people. A woman who had spent years being told what she was. A woman who had finally decided that she would define herself. The screen faded, but the question remained. Why had Hollywood needed Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor to be rivals? Why had magazines, audiences, and headlines constantly demanded a winner? Why couldn't two extraordinary women simply exist beside one another without becoming competitors? Perhaps because rivalry is easier to sell than friendship. Perhaps because conflict creates headlines. Perhaps because people prefer simple stories. One woman rises, another falls. One wins, another loses. One becomes the queen, another disappears. But real life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes two women can shine at the same time. Sometimes admiration can exist beside insecurity. Sometimes two people can be different without being enemies. And sometimes the greatest victory is refusing to fight the person standing beside you. The final image is Marilyn and Elizabeth walking away from the stage. The cameras remain behind them. The audience fades into darkness. The studio lights slowly disappear, and for a brief moment, the two women continue walking side by side. No headlines, no comparisons, no competition, just silence. Then Marilyn stops. Elizabeth turns toward her. Marilyn smiles, and the two women continue walking, together. The story ends there, not with a winner, not with a loser, but with a question that remains long after the applause has disappeared. If Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor never needed to be enemies, who convinced the world that